Goodness me, what a wonderful turnout. If you could take your seats briefly. What a wonderful room full of people. This is superb. And I hope Graeme is particularly chuffed. Welcome to the 5th Graeme Clark Oration. It's really terrific to see you all here this evening. And my name is Natasha Mitchell from ABC Radio National. I host the program Life Matters. Before I fully introduce the evening though, can I ask you, even though I've made you sit down, to be upstanding for the arrival of the Governor of Victoria, the Honourable Alex Chernov and Mrs Elizabeth Chernov. Thank you. Terrific, thank you. Look, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land here, the people of the Kulin Nation and their elders, past, present, future, many generations to come. This oration, as you know, honours Professor Graeme Clark, who pioneered the extraordinary invention of the bionic ear, the cochlear implant. Tonight does much more than that too. In Australia, we are fantastic at honouring sports people while they're alive. We do a superb job of ticker tape parades at football grand final time or for homecomings for Olympians. We're brilliant at that. We're also very good at celebrating celebrities with gold logies and primetime TV shows. What we haven't been so good at, and it blows me away that we're not, is at celebrating great scientists and the impact that their work can have. And tonight is very much about doing that. It's a celebration of applied science that really fundamentally changes our lives and our imaginations, I think. Aren't we all the more richer for our embracing of scientific ideas and exploration, that wonderful curiosity that I love about science and science journalism? And the bionic ear was certainly about that. The story of the bionic ear was about curiosity. The first oration was given by Graeme Clark himself. You will remember Graeme is still very much Professor Bionic because, of course, there is a prototype bionic eye now under development, and Graeme's taken a great lead in that role, in that development. The second oration was given by the charismatic Craig Venter, who ran the commercial enterprise that cracked the human genome along with the public effort to do that. The third oration was given by Terry Sedjanowski. I was involved in introducing that. He explored the role of computers in helping us understand the most complex computing engine of all, our beautiful, beautiful brains. And last year, you might recall that geneticist Dame Linda Partridge offered up a brave new future where drugs can help us stave off the impacts of ageing. Don't we all hope for that? Look, when biology hooks up with computing power, anything's possible. And that's very much what the team behind this whole event is about. They are the ICT for Life Science Forum. They're about breaking down silos between biologists, between physicists, between engineers and those with computing and IT know-how. It's a very powerful combination when you get all those together in a room. And I also want to acknowledge the incredible support for this event, both the oration and the dinner. And if you can look at the sponsor lists on either side of me tonight and feel warm and fuzzy feelings of love towards them, please do. They have put a lot of care and attention into sponsoring this event. Tonight's event is about a theme I can think of no other theme that's more important, actually. Science has the ability to drive powerful social change. Humans are fantastic innovators, but we get an awful lot wrong too. We're capable of creating great tragedies that unfold across all of humanity through greed, through gross inequity, or through the sheer numbers of us on this planet now. 1 in 6 children live under the poverty line in Australia. That's a figure that just came out recently, and that is shocking, isn't it? 1 in 6 children. And worldwide, many, many people live on less than $1 a day. Less than $1. And poverty and health are intimately linked, as we'll hear tonight. And many of you in this room are scientists and involved in agencies who are very much working on that that linkage between health and poverty and doing great work along the way. Our guest speaker tonight, Geoff Lamb, is leading the charge on so many fronts with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Can I just say, if tweeting events is your thing, use the hashtag #GCOration. And to do the honours of introducing Geoff more formally, I'd like to now invite the Governor of Victoria, the Honourable Alex Chernov, to come to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Natasha, and Professor David de Kretser, former Governor of Victoria, and Mrs. Jan de Kretser, Professor Graeme Clark and Mrs. Margaret Clark, Professor Sir Gustav Nossal and Lady Nossal, former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, Professor David Pennington and Dr. Sonal Hussain, Professor Liz Sonnenberg, Director of the Victorian Research Laboratory at National NICTA, many other distinguished guests here this evening, and of course Mr. Geoffrey Lamb and Ms. Caroline Atkinson. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for Elizabeth and me to be at this, the 5th Graeme Clark Oration, which, as we know, was established to honour the great achievements and contributions of Professor Clark to modern medicine and health. The continued growth in the popularity of this lecture is testament both to the quality of the event and the continued interest in the scientific and social development issues by the community of Victoria. The oration, as you've heard, is concerned with bringing together forward-thinking developments in the field of science combined with other disciplines that produce or are likely to produce social benefits of significance, much like what Professor Graeme Clark has done in producing the bionic ear and the current multidisciplinary development of the bionic eye. It involves partnerships and joint ventures because the great challenges of our time are too vast and too costly to be resolved by any one person, entity, and usually through only one discipline. Unsurprisingly, the speaker on each occasion has been a person of eminence in his or her area, and tonight's orator, Mr. Geoffrey Lamb, is no exception. Currently, he is president of the Global Policy and Advocacy arm of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. For completeness, I mention that he is an Irish citizen, which of course means he has much in common with many people in Victoria. He was born, however, and raised in South Africa and worked in the United Kingdom before moving to the United States and eventually joining the foundation. But before joining it in 2006, Mr. Lamb had several senior positions at the World Bank, most recently as Vice President of the Concessional Finance and Global Partnerships. In that capacity, he chaired a series of demanding international negotiations through which governments provided the largest increase in more than 2 decades of the World Bank funding for the world's poorest countries, and subsequently agreed on the financial framework to forgive the multinational debt of 40 countries. In his present capacity, Mr. Lamb has the responsibility for leading the Foundation's international policy and advocacy team's engagement with governments and international institutions. He has been a significant driver in the global effort to reduce global poverty by improving global health through smarter and better research outcomes in tandem with facilitating economic progress in developing countries. In his role at the Gates Foundation, he has been responsible for securing increased aid funding from many governments, including the United Kingdom, Canada and Australia, and his work in that regard has seen significant outcomes. As to the value of research, Sir Gustav Nossal made plain in 2012 that a proper economic evaluation of medical research leads to the conclusion that research funding is a profitable investment, not a cost burden for governments. He cites a report by the Australian Society for Medical Research, which notes that each dollar of funding of medical research provides $2.17 of economic benefit to the community. Sir Gustav's vision is for increased investment in research, driving better prevention and treatment programs that lead to significant increases in efficiencies in the healthcare sector. Our orator and the organisation for which he advocates, the Gates Foundation, have a like vision. Thus, in Australia, for example, since 2000, the Foundation has contributed over $35 million to research in HIV treatments, vaccines and education alone. Other significant funding has also gone towards other health projects, such as eradication of malaria and tuberculosis. But achieving increases in investment in health and medical programs in the foreseeable future is becoming increasingly difficult as governments around the Western world battle with rising pressures on their fiscal positions. Since the onset of the global financial crisis in particular, both the public and private sectors have placed increased pressure on research institutions demanding the same or greater results with slimmer budgets. Thus, there are substantial difficulties now facing those looking towards funding the next step in global poverty alleviation. One such hurdle involves how to generate a groundswell of public support and opinion over what are now more complicated issues than those that faced us before. As our guest speaker commented earlier today on our local radio program, it is about how to get more of the same at the same rate. This is the time when smart advocacy is most needed, and Mr. Lamb's ability and experience will be invaluable in that regard. Our orator's thoughts on how to continue to reduce poverty, how to continue the flow of investments in research and health, vaccines and modified food products will be of great interest to us. He joins us tonight to speak on these difficulties. They can constitute a monumental issue requiring equally monumental efforts to counteract them. And who better to deal with this subject than Mr. Lamb? Hence, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Geoffrey Lamb to deliver the 2013 Graeme Clark Oration.
Well, between the Governor's kind words and Natasha's introduction, I'm now thoroughly intimidated by the scientists in this room, intimidated by my predecessors as orators here, and intimidated by the Governor giving me an introduction which puffs me up way beyond my abilities. So I'm giving you a discount in advance on what was said. I want to start off with a personal note. I was, as you heard, I'm an Irish citizen. I'm a bit of a kind of fake Irishman because I was born and brought up as a South African. I was an Irish citizen because I was a political exile from South Africa during the apartheid years. And the reason for that was that I felt at a relatively early age the outrage at the inequality and oppression that was suffered by the majority of people in South Africa. And that was perhaps a formative influence for me in getting involved in economic development, the plight of poor people, the plight of poor countries. And I've been very lucky, I think, to have been involved in different ways, which the Governor kindly outlined. So I want to talk tonight a bit about that situation of poverty, about how we can all have a contribution, get engaged, and how perhaps Australia, as a forward-thinking and progressive country, both in economic terms and, as we've heard already, in scientific terms, is a very important part of that. So I'm going to be a bit bossy, and I'm going to make you look at some slides as we go along tonight, if you don't mind. So the first thing that I want to say is I'm going to be talking tonight about poverty, hunger, and disease. And I promise you, it's going to be really cheerful. Trust me, trust me. The overwhelming fact is this, that since about 1980, the last 30 years or so, give or take a few, the world, and that is within the living memory of most of the people in this room, or many of the people in this room, the world has had a transformation. The number of absolutely or extremely poor people has declined in a way that is unparalleled in human history, and that is a fantastic achievement. Hundreds of millions more beyond that very minimal poverty level have moved even further up the ladder, have begun to enjoy some of the fruits of life that we all take for granted, frankly, but have been denied for the majority of human beings for so long. So we're going to look at the numbers in a minute. But before we do that, I want to spend a moment talking about that figure of absolute poverty. Natasha referred to people living on under $1 a day. There's been a slight sort of recalculation of that absolute poverty line. We now talk about $1.25 a day as the poverty line for extreme poverty. For all of us, I think, that's an abstraction. We have no idea how people live at that level. So I just want to give you a bit of a hint of that. First, it means that every night people at or below that level go to bed hungry or highly insecure about whether they're going to have adequate food the following day. So there's high insecurity about the most basic element of life, their food and water. Secondly, and this is part of what I want to talk a bit more about tonight, it means that they are in a very precarious mode of life. It means that if the breadwinner, the woman farmer, the male head of household is a day laborer, perhaps in the informal sector, if they get sick with quite an ordinary illness, it can tip an entire family into crisis. It can, and if there is a mini epidemic, an outbreak of measles, an outbreak of malaria, whole communities of poor people can be in crisis in a way that we find difficult to manage. So there is that quality of both very little in the way of possessions, shelter, education, food, and high precariousness and an ability to slide into real penury and deprivation. And the other fact about that kind of poverty is perhaps the most tragic of all. It is highly likely that families at that level will see some, and sometimes all, of their children die before the age of 5. So infant mortality is perhaps the single biggest index of poverty at that level. So that's what it means. And when I talk tonight about the promise of overcoming absolute poverty, that's really what I want to focus on, with your permission. So I've said this has got no real parallel in human history. What has happened over the last generation or so? Let's take a look. First of all, poor countries are growing, and growing pretty well, growing, in fact, much faster than the developed world. This gives you low and middle income countries. Don't worry about the technical terms. It shows what their national economies are doing over time, starting back in the mid-90s and projected forward a few years to 2015. You'll see, except for a dip, as we all experienced during the global crisis a few years ago, you're seeing healthy growth up around the 5, 6, 7, and even 8% mark. So if you look at it by region, for the region that's closest to Australia, for East Asia and Pacific, really strong growth. I think this will be familiar to many of you. 7% even in South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, there used to be a phrase that was used by Indian economists called the Hindu rate of growth, by which they meant 2% or less. Those days are well behind us. We're getting this strong growth. And even in sub-Saharan Africa, one of my interviewers today asked me, well, what about Africa? Isn't that really the basket case of economic development? And the answer is no. For the last 10 years or so, 5% growth, around double the rate that developed countries are able to grow. That gives you the contrast with OECD just means rich countries for shorthand, and we're looking at around 2.5%, 3% growth over the longer term. What that means in practice is that economic growth has done this terrific thing. Look back there, at the beginning of the 1980s, there were almost 2 billion people of a world population. There's some fiddling around with the numbers at the margin, but around 2 billion people out of then a global population of about 4.5 billion who were living in absolute poverty. The economic growth, the globalization, often a bad word, the global transformation of trade, investment, economic activity over this generation, over this 20 or 30 years, has brought those numbers down to just over 1 billion. And in fact, probably by this year or next, it may nudge under 1 billion people. So we've cut those numbers almost in half. 750 million people who used to be right under that desperate poverty line are no longer. They may not have climbed very far up, but they've moved up. And as a proportion of the total population, because of course world population has gone up to about 7 billion people currently, the number of the absolute poor has declined very, very significantly indeed. So that is, by any measure, terrific news. If we look at what that means by region, I love these bubble charts. They look kind of weird, but I love them. Back in the mid-1980s, the size of the bubble means the size of population in poverty, and then the different colors are some of the different regions. You see that huge number, almost 1 billion, the big brownish red bubble up at the top on the left-hand side. That was East Asia and the Pacific. Of course, China looming larger than any other within that. And look how that has come down with the growth, down to 280 million odd by 2008 or 2009. Within that, China, which is the brown number underneath, was about 700 million of that 970, way down to 170 million. So a fantastic economic success story, not only in churning out all the things that we all buy every day, but in bringing down that level of poverty amongst its own people. The less good news on that chart, and that is still in front of us now, the blue is South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And there you see, because the aggregate numbers of population there are growing quite fast, even though they've had some economic success, the rate of poverty has not come down as fast. And then the other one, which is really troubling and still needs tackling, the light gray shows you Africa, very fast population growth, although it's now flattening out, and not such great economic success until just quite recently, the last decade or so. So African total numbers of very poor people actually climb from about 240 to almost 400 million people of the roughly 1 billion Africans that are alive today. So these numbers are a great story. They're an especially great story in the region that is closest to Australia, in which you have all sorts of economic and cultural ties, but it's not good enough. Let's look at health over the same period, because that's where we come to the scientific ability really to operate on poverty and to help in the transformation of people's lives. Let's look at what those poor children that I was talking about earlier actually die from. Those kids who die at under 5 years. There is a lot of neonatal death. Much of it in our societies would never occur It is highly preventable with relatively simple things like attended births, hygienic conditions, warmth, a lack of infection, and so on, and those numbers would come down. But the others that you can see are communicable diseases, infectious diseases that kill children in extraordinary numbers. Pneumonia, almost non-existent childhood pneumonia for kids in middle-income and upper-income countries. Diarrhea, rotavirus, and waterborne diarrheal diseases. Malaria is a significant one. And then a big chunk of that other 24% is AIDS and measles and other communicable diseases as well. So we have big causes of death in the under 5 population. That's how they break down. But if we look there at what's happened to child deaths, it's also a dramatically good story over the last generation or a bit more. From 20 million children dying worldwide under 5 in 1960, down to about 7 million or a bit less now, at a time when the numbers of children obviously were going up very sharply. So proportionately, a huge success. Still far too many kids dying of things that can be prevented, but a huge success and huge human progress. So let's ask ourselves where we are and how this happened. And I want to focus on just a couple of things. First, it is absolutely striking how important strong economic growth is, how economic growth has driven so much of this improvement in the human condition. I do want to emphasize again an improvement that we have never seen on this scale in human history. So economic growth and continued economic growth is absolutely fundamental. But we've also seen fantastic improvements in public health internationally, and particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, and the Gates Foundation, I'm proud to say, has been an important partner in this. We've seen big advances in bringing the international community together to give really strong support to public health in poor countries that normally had highly inadequate public health systems, highly inadequate access to the basic things that our societies take for granted. So we can see some of the things that have happened. Polio is virtually, but unfortunately only virtually, eradicated. We have just 3 countries now in which wild polio virus is still endemic: Nigeria, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And as you can hear, countries where, for reasons of conflict and civil strife, really difficult to go that last mile and get this, the second major human disease, to be eradicated. To achieve that, the only one that we've done so far is smallpox, as many people here know, as Australia was a great contributor to. We've seen, after an uptick, a bad uptick in the 80s and 90s, we see malaria cases coming down again in countries where malaria is endemic and a huge killer of people, and particularly a killer of children. Huge, cut in half, mainly by what you see in the background there, the spread of hundreds of millions of bed nets, so that mothers and families can protect their kids at night. And in fact, just over the last 10 years or so, we have really seen the public health effort in so many of these areas take shape in a way that I think has got terrific promise. For example, that Gavi alphabet soup, that's the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, an international unit that is bringing vaccines that otherwise take years and years and years to trickle down, new vaccines for pneumonia, for rotavirus, for other childhood diseases. Bring them, and now starting to roll out human papillomavirus for adolescent girls as well. 370 million kids have been vaccinated by Gavi funding, And the estimate is that over 5 million deaths that would have occurred have been averted as a result of that. We've seen the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria. I'll talk a bit more about AIDS in a moment. They have, against all the odds and against skepticism, which I confess I shared, they have managed to put over 4 million people on life-saving antiretroviral treatment. They have managed to roll out TB treatment. It still needs to be improved. There are still problems. We can discuss that. But almost 10 million people have received TB treatment by Global Fund money, and the bed nets, more than 300 million, which I referred to earlier. So there are, alongside the economic growth, which is powering people out of poverty, we have this fantastic effort in global health that my foundation, our foundation, is a part of, that the Australian government is a great partner in, that is making a huge impact on things that have killed poor people and killed children in particular for many years. So if we stand back and look at that several decades of achievement, what does it mean now, and what does it mean when we look forward? I think there are a couple of things that are worth noting. First of all, it really is now possible to think of an effective end to absolute poverty. It's possible to think that within about, let's say, 2 decades, around 2030 or a little bit afterwards, those numbers of 1 billion people still in absolute poverty and below $1.25 a day will be reduced dramatically to perhaps under 100 million. And those 100 million will be really hard to tackle because they'll be living in failed states or highly isolated circumstances or other things where it's difficult to lift them up with economic growth. Economic growth, if governments have halfway sensible policies, if the international economy that Australia is a great proponent of, the open international economy, moves forward, that result is entirely possible. It needs some things. It needs to make that governments need to make sure and countries need to make sure that poor people are pulled into the mainstream rather than pushed to the margins, that employment-intensive development gives them the possibility of engagement and success, even at that very modest level. But if all plausible economic projections in which poor countries are full participants in the global economy have huge promise for taking that number of 1 billion or so that we still have at these unacceptable levels of poverty way, way down, perhaps cutting them by 80 or 90%, again, over the next decade or two, which would be a fantastic achievement on its own. But, and this is the but, we need to recognize that economic growth on its own and progress in lifting up incomes that little bit on its own does not resolve that precariousness of life, that vulnerability of life that I mentioned earlier on as part of the definition of what it means to be so poor. So along with that investment in economic growth, that investment in education and infrastructure and the other things that are part of a modern economy and a successful economy, we need to do more. And this comes back to the issue of health, because we need to recognize that what poor people tend to die of or to suffer from or to be pushed off track and into crisis from are things which are overwhelmingly public health rather than privately bought health that we are all used to. So, for example, even while my own country of birth, South Africa, moved into freedom, into democracy in the early 1990s, Nelson Mandela, whose trial I covered as a young reporter in the 1960s, when he was sentenced to life imprisonment, became the president. We had a flowering of South African democracy and an increase in economic openness and growth. That was also the decade, the 1990s, when South Africa, along with many other countries, suffered the cataclysm of HIV/AIDS. And I'll say again on a personal note, where I had felt very politically committed to economic development, economic and political equality, and the importance of that struggle, the experience of HIV and AIDS was the thing in the 1990s that first pulled me towards the huge importance of health in human development and health in human opportunity. And in fact, there is a distinguished Australian in this room, Ian Gust, who has been my colleague on the board of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, which I got involved in towards the end of the 1990s, where we are working together, hopefully someday, to get the end game for HIV. Even as we've made those advances in treatment of people, even as we've made huge strides in prevention, in antiretroviral treatment, in new approaches that might even use antiretrovirals as a kind of prevention tool itself. All of those things are very exciting and are moving ahead. In the end, I think it's my conviction, the conviction of many others, that we will need a vaccine. Australians and many others are working towards that end, an exceptionally difficult scientific challenge, and one that is so urgent because economic development does not solve AIDS. Malaria can increase and did increase in countries that were growing and progressing economically. So the public health focus, the international effort for health has to go alongside economic development. It's not substituted by growth and by higher incomes necessarily, although they certainly help. So that's why, really, you have a highly, how shall I put it, highly focused business person like Bill Gates, a highly successful and focused person. If you ask Bill, why did you get involved through your foundation in global health as your single biggest area of concentration? I won't speak for him, but I think I know the answer that he has in his mind. The answer that he has in his mind is there's all this progress, there is all this increase in GDP, as he sometimes says with a slightly contemptuous wave. But how is it that solutions and treatments and vaccines that cost a few dollars don't get to the kids that need it? How come that the normal new vaccine, the normal practice is that it takes about 20 years for those vaccines to trickle down to the poorest people in the poorest countries? And his view was that's just an outrage, that's just unacceptable. And I think that spirit of saying there are health solutions that we know about, there are health solutions that great scientists, like some of the scientists in this room that the governor referred to, that scientists are working on and can get to. We should not let poverty and distance and low social status in the scheme of things stop kids from having access to those life-giving opportunities. And we should not wait for economic development eventually to give us solutions to that. So I'm very pleased, I'm delighted and flattered and, as I said, intimidated that so many of you have thought it's worthwhile to turn out tonight to think about these issues and think about the promise that we see in the growth of incomes, the decline of poverty, and the opportunities for health. And I'm very glad to say that, the Gates Foundation is very active in this. I've been lucky enough to see some of that work at first hand, see some of the work on malaria, see some of the communities back in South Africa again that are benefiting now, mining communities with migrant workers who are characteristically very big bearers of the HIV virus, being able to rebuild their communities because there are now treatments available and there is hope where before there had been death, growing at an alarming rate. So we've made great progress. We need, I want to say, to keep that up, and for health, it needs much more conscious action even than for the economic growth that we're going to need over the next couple of decades. And I'm very glad to say that some of the examples that I gave earlier, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, I'm very glad to say Australia, through AusAid, has been a terrific supporter and a strong partner in building that capability internationally. I'm delighted that Australia has been a great partner with us and with many others on pushing for that final eradication of polio, has been a strong supporter of the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria, building that international coalition that is based on strong science, on really business-like methods of getting the fruits of science out to communities and people that need it, but could not normally go out into the marketplace and buy it, and has been creative along with us in finding those solutions. For example, the Vaccine Alliance has been terrific at working directly with the private sector. The private sector would say, gosh, you know, we'd love to help on vaccines, but these are poor people. We're not sure there's a market there. Maybe we'll stick to giving the vaccines to health services in Australia and the United States and the UK and France and so on. The Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, has been creative in saying, we will provide you with a guarantee of a price, in this case for pneumonia vaccine, if you will guarantee to supply it. Here's the price. The money is there, contributed by Australia, the Gates Foundation, the UK, and many others. It provides a market, it provides private sector incentives, and it provides solutions for poor people that absolutely wouldn't otherwise be there. I'm very happy that Australia has been so forward-leaning in this and such a strong partner. And I think that sort of solution is what we're going to need redoubled over the coming years, because one of the thoughts that I'll leave, and this is perhaps not so much a less optimistic one, but more just to remind us that as we become more successful in solving problems, the last miles get a bit tougher. The last miles need more investment, more attention, and more commitment. So as we get closer to bringing down those TB numbers, we do see a rise in multi-drug resistant TB, much more expensive, much more difficult to cope with, but we need the science to be applied to get the solution for that. As we see with malaria, we have the bed nets that will do a certain amount, the drug-impregnated bed nets in preventing it. We see the effectiveness of some of the new therapies, artemisinin, combination therapy, but we see the first emergence of resistance to that drug, a drug which is now our best therapy against, our best defense against malaria. So we need to go the next step. Is it an effective malaria vaccine? We aren't quite there yet. Is it some other drug that needs to be developed? Is it tackling the human host so that the human host no longer is the source of infection that mosquitoes spread from one to another? We need to keep that work moving forward. As I said, on the big funding, the aid funding that Australia does through AusAid, some of these investments, and AusAid has looked at this carefully and done studies on this, are some of the best investments of foreign aid that there are. The most effective, the most efficient in terms of bang for the Australian buck your constantly rising and more valuable Australian dollar, and a great use of taxpayers' money, even as taxpayers scrutinize what's being done with their money because of fiscal constraints and economic anxieties. So it's a great investment. It's also, and I would like to say this in bringing it to an end, it's also so heartening that Australia is using its strong scientific base, so richly represented in this city and in the institutions of learning and science in this state, to bring to bear on the problems that affect the world's poorest people, to bring to bear on malaria, on HIV, on pneumonia, on the other diseases of poverty, and the problems about how to find smart solutions and cost-effective solutions to them. So I'm very grateful for Australian partnership, for our work at the Gates Foundation, for Australia as a great proponent of strong economic growth and open markets and open opportunity. And I'm very grateful, too, for the commitment of Australian scientists as epitomized in the great tradition of Graeme Clark in tackling the really important problems of human misery and illness and bringing us closer to that day when not only can we say there are almost no extremely poor people left in the world, but we can also say the things that we can tackle that kill poor people, we have brought under control and we're bringing ultimately to eradication. Thank you very much indeed.
Goodness me, doesn't that give you real pause for thought? And I would love to be a fly on the wall in the room where you, Geoff, and Bill Gates get together to talk about the extent to which GDP is an adequate measure of well-being. It is good to hear good news, isn't it? But I'm sure Geoff would agree that we can't afford to be lulled into a false sense of comfort in the West when we hear that good news, as we have tonight, and that there are so many other challenges, not the least the scientific challenge of multi-drug resistant malaria, TB, causing great affliction and suffering. TB and malaria alone do, but when you can't find the drug to treat it, it's even worse. So a great treat, and I would love to welcome to the stage now the man himself, Graeme Clark, to give his thanks on behalf of all of us to Geoff Lamb.
Your Excellency, Mrs. Chernoff, Mr. Geoff Lamb, Miss Carolyn Atkinson, Natasha, and all the distinguished guests, I'm sure you'll agree that Geoff Lamb's oration was simply outstanding, and his work is showing the way to do even greater good by sharing wealth, targeting areas of need, and being innovative in bringing that help. Geoff, your leadership of the global policy and advocacy for the Gates Foundation is an inspiration in building strategic relationships that are essential for ensuring the Foundation's work is fulfilled. I'm blown away by all the measures you are undertaking to make absolute poverty history. I can emphasize with the challenges you have faced. Although there are approximately 700 million people worldwide with significant hearing disability, only a modest number get help with modern aids or implants, and this is because many countries don't have the resources, and we would like to change this too. I'd especially like to thank Geoff on behalf of scientists in Melbourne and Australia who have been supported by the Gates Foundation. This support is invaluable and plays a key role in the global outreach of the Foundation. A big thank you too for all of you coming out on this cold evening. I'd also like to acknowledge those from schools who've come. I hope that Geoff's inspiring address will lead you to future endeavours to make the world a better place. Geoff, we have appreciated your memorable oration and visit. Could I invite you to please accept this trophy in appreciation for inspiring us, and I hope that this trophy is not only a work of art, but it's a replica of the human inner ear, which is very important for communication, and communication is really what you're talking about tonight. Thank you for your presentation. Finally, I'd like to congratulate Luan Ismail on organising another successful oration and the many organisations that have been responsible. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
As Graeme exits the stage, let's give him a really big, raucous hurrah. And louder. Isn't it an honour to have Graeme with us tonight to celebrate the oration in his name? Thank you, Graeme. And thank you, Geoff Lamb. On that note, that concludes this year's oration, but it gives us an awful lot to think about. And I guess what we can do in our own lives, because we can see the figures and we can see the bar charts, but really it all happens when we actually start affecting change as well. And how do we reach beyond our own neighbourhood, our own city, our own state? How do we have an international impact in the decisions that we make in our own lives? So it's been my delight to be with you. We have been recording tonight's event for likely broadcast on Big Ideas on TV, on ABC TV and also Radio National, and it will also go up in a couple of days on the ICT for Life Sciences forum, as well, a website as well, I should say. And also, as you exit tonight, there is a DVD doco which is being launched tonight, which tells the story of Graeme Clark and the bionic ear. Too often we often only hear the headlines, don't we? The actual breakthrough. Well, this is a documentary that celebrates what happened behind the scenes to achieve the bionic ear. So please pick up a free copy of that as you're leaving tonight. It's called Never Say Never, the Graeme Clark story. Thank you again to tonight's sponsors, an extraordinary array of sponsors, and thank you very much for coming to the 2013 Graeme Clark Oration. And please, let's thank Geoff Lamb once again. Thank you.